Hello and welcome to Maiden, Mother, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is William Costello. He's a doctoral researcher in evolutionary psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, and he's published several empirical articles on the psychology of incels, involuntary celibates, as we'll go on to explain, and has also worked on government research on behalf of the Commission for Countering Extremism, again on incel ideology. We spoke today about the Netflix series Adolescence, what it gets wrong about incel ideology, what it gets wrong about the demographics of teenage murderers, why incels are not necessarily far right, nor are they necessarily ugly or physically unattractive, why incels serve as a useful scapegoat for wider societal problems, particularly at a time when grooming gangs are back in the news, as we discussed, and whether involuntarily childless women are, in a sense, a female analogue to the incel phenomenon. And we talked about this within the context of evolutionary biology and sexual selection more generally. As always, the extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can find all of the other extended episodes that have been published on MMM, the chat community, which is very active, the bonus episodes I do with my husband for founding members, and the writing I host on Substack as well. Just a quick reminder that the young adult edition of the Case Against Sexual Revolution has just been published. It's a abridged and somewhat, a carefully edited version of the Case Against Sexual Revolution to make it suitable for a teenage audience. So it's been made simpler and less distressing. I intended it as something that parents in particular, but other adults too, could give to their teenage children if they felt that they benefit from reading it. So if you know a young person who you think would be well served by receiving this book as a gift, do think about buying it for them. Okay, William, should we dive in at the deep end? What does adolescence get wrong about incels? What's the biggest thing that it gets wrong about incels, would you say? Their most glaring error?
Well, one of the first things to say that it gets wrong is our response to it, particularly from politicians. Policymakers and policy should be informed by sober research rather than highly emotive performance art, no matter how powerful the acting is. So that's
I've heard it's a documentary, though. I've heard from several people, including twice from the Prime Minister, that it's a documentary.
Yeah, which either belies that they haven't seen it themselves or that they're just completely confused about the line between fiction and reality, which is kind of really troubling. But just the overall weight that's been put behind this show from our very top politicians is kind of disconcerting. But in terms of what it gets right and wrong about the research, so there's many ways in which the knife crime depicted in Adolescence doesn't fit typical knife crime of the UK. So, for example, I read an article that pulled it all together. It said, teenage male killing teenage female is the lowest likelihood form of knife violence. About 8.7% of stabbing victims are female. Like most forms of non-domestic violence, knife crime tends to be overwhelmingly male on male. Furthermore, non-whites are about 5 times more likely to be knife crime offenders than whites, though whites account for most knife crime due to the weight of the numbers in the UK. And only about 4.5% of knife crime victims are under 16. So taken together, white male adolescent offender and young female victim is by far the least common combination in knife crime. Now, that matters, and it's fine to have creative license and create whatever show you want, but when the writers of the show are really in every interview up and down the country saying how this has been inspired by the epidemic of knife crime in this country, and how our politicians are reacting as if this is documentary or to be taken seriously and can reveal something about the problems it seeks to depict, then it really matters, and you should scrutinize the realism on that front. I do think the show did a good job of kind of portraying how it didn't really draw a straight causal arrow of what caused the crime. It's kind of did a scattergun approach of a lot of different potentially contributing factors. The aggressive male role models hinted at pornography's influence. But one thing that it did hint at, or it comes to the conclusion at the end, the parents are kind of looking back through the rearview mirror and chastising themselves for not monitoring closely enough the online content that their son was engaging with. So it's kind of hints that this was motivated by incel content or manosphere content. And just to be very clear, there is no epidemic of manosphere inspired violence in the UK like is depicted in Adolescence. That just simply hasn't occurred. Even around the globe, the level of incel violence is vastly overblown by the media. There's been 59 people killed in a handful of spree killings by incels. And even those cases, some of them are kind of only loosely tied to the ideology. So they're kind of somewhat contested how causal the incel ideology was. But one thing I think it did get right was it showed that for young men, whether you go down the incel rabbit hole or not, the fact that you're able to be insulted for being an incel, even at the age of 13, when every 13-year-old boy is an incel,
You'd
the
hope
fact that you
so.
can be insulted for this, it kind of shows that this extra pressure is there for young boys to prove their sexual assertiveness, to prove that they're the type of man that will become sexually selected. So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, they're not very typical of incels according to the research.
So one thing that the show is sort of unclear on, and it's not, I don't know whether this is because the writers don't understand or if the characters don't understand, or it's not really clear, but there's this elision between Andrew Tate and incel ideology, even though to my mind, Andrew Tate is obviously not an incel because kind of his whole point is that he has loads of women. That's exactly what he projects, right?
Yeah, so I don't know whether this was intentionally done by the writers to kind of accurately depict the confusion of a lot of adults about this topic, or whether they
Mm-hmm.
themselves are just genuinely confused. But they did write into the show that the female detective says, incels, oh yeah, that's that Andrew Tate shite. And that, for
Mm-hmm.
anyone even slightly familiar with the topic, knows that there's a world of difference between Andrew Tate and incels and the red pill and the black pill.
Mm-hmm.
Andrew Tate, I've seen on Twitter him antagonizing incels and goading them into hanging around with him for the weekend so he can prove to them how easy it is to not be an incel and how he'll coach them through it. But it shows this fundamental kind of misunderstanding of lumping a whole host of problematic male behaviors in together. Far
Mm-hmm.
right, manosphere, all of it gets lumped in together. And it's actually quite inconvenient that the research consistently shows that incels aren't far right in their politics. They actually come out center left on average in the way they define themselves. And also, when we ask them a series of political questions using the Pew ideological consistency scale. So, yeah, I don't know whether that was intentional depiction of the confusion of adults from the writers or whether they're just confused.
Yeah, impossible to know. I mean, also kind of impossible to know across the whole show because it does feel as if the show was written to press the buttons of like normie parents up and down the country to promote something maximally frightening. Particularly because, I mean, we mentioned the murderer in the show is not an accurate depiction of a typical murderer in terms of demographics. Another way that he's not typical is that he comes from a stable home and has not been abused himself and has apparently got no history of violence or even criminality at all until he suddenly escalates to murder. And that's obviously not true. That's extremely atypical. I mean, I'm not aware of any story where that, like real story where that happened. And, but I guess it's sort of designed to make even parents of completely normal, sensible children feel terrified, and they seem to have succeeded in that goal.
Yeah, it's they're capitalizing on the confusion that parents have about this kind of novel mating market, novel potentially nefarious online influences. But
Mm,
yes, it is every parent's nightmare to think they might unwittingly be raising a monster who goes on to commit a heinous crime like that. But it's extraordinarily unlikely. Most
mm,
teenagers who are capable of stabbing a female classmate have shown signs of antisocial behavior, if not out and out psychopathy. The idea that it would just happen out of the blue like that is very, very unlikely. I think parents, they know their children more than they might think. Even if you're son is spending a lot of time online on his computer. That's pretty normal. It's not the end of the world. Even if he's a little bit disgruntled and angry, also kind of normal for a teenager. And this was confusing for me because I've seen a lot of people commenting online that episode 3, where Jamie has the antagonistic kind of interrogation with this prison psychiatrist, a lot of people said, oh, this revealed him to be the psychopath that he is, and he was so manipulative. And for me, having worked in schools up and down the UK, I just recognized a fairly ordinary, angry teenager who kind of oscillates between extreme cooperation, trying to cultivate rapport, extreme antagonism, extreme anger, kind of self-loathing, low self-esteem, trying to put on a big front. There was nothing there in that episode that I thought wouldn't be there only for Jamie has been watching Andrew Tate. Maybe a little bit of bitterness about the psychiatrist being a pretty girl, living life on easy mode, as they might say it. A little bit of insecurity about presenting himself as sexually successful, which isn't that unusual for a teenage boy either. I thought that the psychiatrist actually somewhat tried to pathologize fairly normally developing teenage male sexuality. Yeah, it was just it's strange. I don't know how. I feel like parents who are saying, "Oh, that was so revealing of the psychopath." I think they're pretty blessed with their kids, because I recognize kids like that in that episode in every school in the UK.
So, one of the cases that the creators have specifically cited as having inspired this story was I remember this case in the news because it happened when we were living not that far away. And so it kind of jumped out to me because it was so awful. A teenage boy called Hassan Sentamu who killed a girl on a bus because she'd rejected his romantic advances. Yeah, I mean, it was just an appalling incident, and had almost nothing to do with this fictional case because Hassan Sentamu had an incredibly long record of escalating violence, which included bringing knives into school and threatening other children, and and he had also, I think the story was that he had been abused by his family in Uganda and had had a really miserable life. And it's so galling for this to be cited directly as inspiration for a case which just grossly misrepresents the sort of young man who's likely to commit a murder like this.
Yeah, I mean, the writers have said it's absurd to be accused of miscasting with the race. Well, then just tell us specifically which white male 13-year-old killers are the inspiration.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are non-zero examples of this. I mean, the murders of Jamie Bulger would be an obvious one. It's obviously a very old case now. And also the murderers of Brianna Gay, I think, were white. But then in both of those cases, all of those children were deeply troubled and had escalating behavior. So again, there's no example available to us of this just coming out of the blue. And I think you're so right about the episode with the psychologist seeming to pathologize what is actually normal teenage boy behavior. I mean, the show has been read quite rightly by a lot of people as just being deeply anti-male in the way that it represents these. It really just does demonize young men to an absurd degree.
Yeah, I did think that although it's not plausible in terms of its statistical likelihood of the demography of the killer, but the way it was depicted as having happened, the trajectory to violence was somewhat plausible. What I mean by that is it didn't just depict a cold-blooded psychopathic killer. It kind of depicted this tragedy unfolding where a well-raised but insecure young boy suffers a public humiliation on Instagram, where he's called an incel by his bully, who he ends up killing. And I thought it was bold that they would even suggest that the female victim who ends up being killed, or who is killed from the outset, that she could have triggered the violence with bullying by calling him an incel online. I thought it was interesting that it showed how social media can escalate this public humiliation by allowing a lot of people to like it and create this kind of consensus among the bullying victim that, oh my God, my whole year group agrees that I'm an incel. It showed how he somehow found a knife in his possession. There is a lot of knives kind of on the ground in England now. And he didn't go out to kill her. It didn't suggest that he did that, but he went to confront her to rectify this public humiliation, and things got out of hand. I thought that was interesting, that was somewhat plausible, because public humiliation like that about your sexuality would perhaps be a plausible trigger for violence, and things could have got out of hand. But yeah, it's not very typical.
I guess they included this plot line about the online humiliation as a further stick with which to beat the internet, right? Because the core message of the show is that the internet is incredibly dangerous for teenagers, and so they were showing another way in which it can be misused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that seems to be one of the overarching messages that we're meant to learn from the show. Jack Thorne, one of the writers, said that social media is the new cigarettes. And that's an extraordinary claim, given how contested in the literature the ill effects of social media are. That debate is ongoing. It's not like settled consensus in the science that's something we all agree on. Certainly not to the level of the clear-cut harm of cigarettes, but it does seem to be my kind of conspiracy theorist take, is that it is being used as a catalyst to bring in overreaching internet online safety bills, because those overreaching paternalistic kind of measures are always done under the guise of for your own safety and for the safety of the children. So it seems like a real that really feels to be like what this show is functioning to achieve.
I think that's the mildest conspiracy theory I've heard in relation to adolescence. I mean, I don't, I don't. Well, there are various conspiracy theories in play about whether it was actually made for the intention of bolstering the government's position on this, because I believe it was at least partly made with taxpayer funding via, various other channels. I think what's certainly going on is that it is now being used to bolster the government's online safety proposals, and that's why it's been pushed so hard by the government, and the proposal is that it's shown in all schools and all this kind of stuff. I think it scratches various political itches as a show, whether or not it was made for this purpose. I think it's more that it's arrived at a certain moment where the demonization of young white men is very much at the top of a lot of commentators' brains and government and ministers' brains, and they seem to be very susceptible to believing that fiction is an accurate depiction of reality, which is not actually unique historically. I mean, there are famous examples of fiction being very politically important. Uncle Tom's Cabin would probably be the most famous example of fiction being used in support of a particular political position. There are lots of others. But given that this is, as we talked about, so far from the truth, it's hard not to conclude that that this is just a moral panic about the internet, really, and particularly a moral panic about Andrew Tate.
Yeah, and it does seem to be backfiring a little bit, I think. I think maybe perhaps the government thought they would just capitalize on the positive attention of the show and that they would get off scot-free on that front, but they've been called out, and it's pretty bipartisan, the people calling them out. You've got Aaron Bastani, extreme left-wing commentator, the right-winger criticizing them. Nobody seems to agree. Even Jess Taylor, who's a feminist activist, she's the one who started a petition to have the plans to show it in every school in the UK pulled. But quite rightly so. It's just at best, it's a knee-jerk reaction to the popularity of the show. Like, there could not be evidence that showing this program in every school in the UK will have positive effects. And there's actually good reason to think it will have negative effects. For one, I'm very concerned about the idea of motivating future spree killers, because they're often very focused on notoriety, where they want to cruise for a cause that will garner the most public attention. So if you suddenly send the message to future incel spree killers that, oh, we can have your topic discussed in Parliament, we can have a Netflix show made about your story, show it to every school in the UK, that's a lot of notoriety. So it could potentially be dangerous for that reason and a lot of others.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a really disturbing thing to show children in schools. It's a kind of horrible thing to watch, and it seems like inflicting that on children for the sake of basically like older adult panic about something they don't understand is not fair, even aside from the political stuff.
And one thing the show did quite well was they depicted the struggles that schools face, and basically that they're overstretched, the teachers are burnt out, they're basically functioning as poorly run prisons to kind of just behavioral management. So the show depicted that quite accurately, yet wants to ask those schools to manage the fallout of showing this program with all the emotions it will trigger. It's kind of funny. They even in the show go as far as to lampoon one of the male teachers. All the males in the program are actually depicted as a bit inept to some degree.
Except maybe the detective inspector. He's quite a heroic figure.
He is a little bit, but he's also seen as kind of bumbling and has to rely on his son. He doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah, I
So there's
suppose,
little bits of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so they depicted one teacher in particular, Mr. Malik, as being extremely burnt out. He comes into class late with his shirt untucked, and he asks the cop, he says, "What do you expect us to want to do? And with these kids, what can we do?" And they lampoon him for being overly reliant on showing videos in class. Yet fast
Yeah.
forward a couple of weeks, that's the plan for the start of the intervention around this topic.
It's also sort of funny to think. I mean, it reminds me so much actually of some of the silly ideas that you encounter about consent workshops, which I used to teach in schools and designed at one point, in that there's a very strong belief among proponents of consent workshops that sexual violence is a consequence of mistaken beliefs, and that if you can correct those mistakes, then you can end sexual violence, because they don't believe that there's any like biological component to this, or and I guess that's the same thinking with not only with adolescence but with so much didactic approaches to social and political issues, that if you can just tell people from a young enough age, actually everything you think about this is false, that they will be like, oh, yeah. One, they'll believe you, because famously teenage boys in particular, they just love listening to their teachers on these matters, right? They take it very seriously and they always accept what they're told. And two, that the only thing that's motivating some of these destructive social forces is just error.
Yeah, I've always been very confused, specifically about the sexual violence thing. So our lab researches some controversial issues like sexual exploitability, what factors among women make them more or less sexually exploitable. We think that's very useful to know because, like you say, most sexually violent men or most rapists are not interested in being taught how to not be rapists. Whereas you could plausibly say 100% of women should be interested in learning anything they can do to be safer. As a man, I'm interested in learning a lot of things I can do to be safer from physical violence, which I'm more at risk of. So I don't understand. We get accused of victim blaming, and we're told, oh, you should teach the rapists not to rape. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, we would if we thought that would have anywhere near the efficacy of teaching women how to be safer or their defenses against this sexual violence.
Yeah, we've given that a good go, guys, and it has made absolutely zero effect. I think that what it's likely to do, adolescents, I mean, there's the risk of inspiring spree killers, as you say. There's the very high risk that teenagers just laugh at it and think it's silly. There's the risk that they just find it upsetting and they don't engage. There's also a very high probability that a lot of disaffected young men, particularly white men, correctly interpret it as being further libel against them. And it just makes them angrier with the authorities. That seems like a very likely outcome from adolescence, rather than that these boys will be shamed, which is, I think, the intention.
Yeah, and if you want to pick up on the racial component, even of the fans of the Manosphere, there's a study from the Institute of Strategic Dialogue, who I know to be quite a progressive organization, so I was very surprised to see them publish these findings. But they published this article saying 1 in 5 young people have a positive opinion of Andrew Tate. But when you dig down into their report, it's just 15% of white people had a popular opinion of Andrew Tate. That rises to 31% of Asian respondents, and by Asian, I mean South Asian in the UK, and that rises to 41% of Black respondents. So there is a racialized component to this Manosphere fans, and also incels in particular. We find that 42% of incels in our research are incels of color. So that's an overrepresentation for a exclusively US and UK sample. But yeah, so I do think that being made to be the scapegoat young white boys for this problem is just misses the mark on a number of fronts.
Yes, it's really interesting that Andrew Tate's fans are not represented in this racialized way in the popular representation. I mentioned this findings to someone recently, the fact that actually young white men are less likely than other groups to admire him. And they were amazed. They'd never ever heard this before. I mean, obviously to some extent with online phenomena, it's kind of hard. You have to do this survey as you describe. You can't otherwise get a sense of who the fans are. But Andrew Tate has become this incredible bogeyman, particularly in British political culture, that he's just blamed for everything under the sun. He's become a very useful figure in that regard. And I mean, it does strike me that I'm sure that part of what is going on with adolescence is a sense among viewers that something is deeply amiss in British culture, that they are aware of the problem of knife crime or of angry young men or whatever it is, that they don't really have the means to understand what's really going on. And so this is sort of a massive displacement exercise. And that adolescence has created two hate figures. One is Andrew Tate, and the other is this imaginary 13-year-old boy, that are useful repositories for these displaced feelings of anger and fear.
Yeah, because you could make the argument that if the government were really concerned with misogyny in the UK, they would be most concerned with Islamism, which is some of the most misogynistic culture you can imagine, but is kind of ignored or swept under the carpet.
Oh, that's the amazing thing, right? That in the same week that we're seeing the leader of the opposition, for instance, Kemi Badenoch, lambasted by her BBC interviewers for not having seen Adolescence. I thought she gave quite a good response to that, which is, I don't watch Casualty to understand what's going on in the NHS. But one of the interviewers, again, made the mistake of describing Adolescence as a documentary. So the same week where not watching Adolescence is seen to be this absolute disgrace, the inquiries into grooming gangs have also been cancelled by the Labour Party. So on the one hand, you have an absolutely real and very widespread and very horrifying example of real sexual violence, including instances of murder, swept under the rug. And indeed, I mean, did you watch the clip from Parliament of Katie Lamb giving a speech about grooming gangs, which was very well done? And she, not only did Jess Phillips basically brush her off, this is the Minister for Safeguarding, but also there were several speeches from the floor basically condemning her for having raised the issue at all and saying that she was, being racist, inciting Islamophobia, etc., etc. So the expectation is, and indeed there was one parliamentarian who said, one, this is Islamophobic, shut up, and two, I hope that the government can commit to like further strengthening the online harms bill and cracking down on internet speech even further. It's just crazy. And then meanwhile, Adolescence is treated as a documentary. I feel like I'm going mad.
Yeah, the one politician seemed more horrified by the accusation of drawing attention to the grooming gangs and the religious or racial component to it. That was more horrifying to her, seemingly, than the actual grooming gang scandal itself. Here in America, when I explain to people about the grooming gangs, at first they really think I'm a crackpot conspiracy theorist. I mean, it sounds obscene. Thousands of working class girls for decades. Oh, yeah, I'm sure. But then when you look into it, it's kind of now in the UK, at least everyone accepts that it happened. But, I remember 10, 15 years ago, the only person talking about this was Tommy Robinson. And to be seen to believe in this was to be seen to be far right. At least we've moved on from that. But the decision by the Labour government to put this back into the hands of the councils to decide how they want to investigate it further, that seems crazy when they are the very councils that allowed this to happen for decades. That's
Indeed.
insane.
Matriarch is brought to you by Qualia, the advanced nutrition brand that's raising the bar on what's possible in the world of human longevity and health optimization. If you're struggling with tiredness, low energy, lack of focus, aches and pains associated with aging, generally feeling run down, struggling to recover from gym sessions, you are not alone. I know how it feels, and I've started taking Qualia supplements to help with exactly these problems. Qualia offer 4 different iterations of their product depending on what exactly ails you. So I'm taking Qualia Senolytic to help with my achy joints, and also their NAD Plus supplement to boost my energy levels. I'll keep you all updated on how I get on over the coming months. If, like me, you want to age better, feel better day to day, then head to qualialife.com/matriarch for 15% off your purchase. That's Qualia, spelled Qualia, qualialife.com/matriarch, all capital letters. I don't think it's excessively conspiracist to think that the Labour Party don't want these inquiries because it would implicate the Labour Party, because these are invariably in Labour-run councils, and I think it's extraordinarily likely that councillors were involved in the cover-up, if not the actual perpetration of the crimes. Yeah, I mean, this is what I mean when I talk about displacement. I think that there's a strong sense in the country of something being deeply wrong, and adolescence, I mean, the popular response to it has been quite remarkable, in that not only the interviewers whipping themselves up into a lather demanding whether or not politicians have watched this show, but it has this energy of like, bang your pots and pans together for the NHS and the Paddington Bear and all this kind of like weird twee hysteria that Brits can quite easily get whipped up into.
Yes.
So that has been generated around a completely false representation of violence against women, which is absolutely real, and being covered up.
I think it's just that the victims of the grooming or the rape gang scandals, they're the wrong type of victim. They're not as kind of, they don't make for as good television. They're not as...
Is the victim in Adolescence, she's white or is she mixed race? I can't remember.
I think she's mixed race, but a lot of people have been complaining that she's not the center of the program at all. She's not really given much attention, so it doesn't really matter as such.
Yeah, it's about the perpetrator. Yeah. Should we talk a bit more about incel ideology as a thing? Because you've mentioned already that it's not really far right, in the sense that most incels don't identify as far right at all. They seem to basically have roughly the opinions of like the standard person on Reddit or something, right? What therefore does incel ideology consist of if it's not easily placed along the political spectrum?
Yeah, so Incel stands for involuntary celibate, and they're this online subculture of men who form their identity around their perceived inability to form sexual or romantic relationships. Like I said, there's been a handful of spree killings, ideologically motivated. Central to the ideology is their belief in the black pill. And this is the idea that for many, or maybe most men, it's pointless to even try to cultivate romantic relationships, and you should just give up and stop trying. Incels are often framed as a terrorist threat, and just to put that into context, are you familiar with Prevent?
Sure am.
So Prevent
Are they familiar with me? That's the question. Anyway, go on.
Prevent is this government program aimed at identifying individuals at risk of radicalization. Now, incel referrals to Prevent reached the grand total of 77 last year, and that accounts for just little over 1% of all referrals. So in terms of the terrorism threat, it is still very clear that it is not the major threat, does not come from incels, but it comes from Islamists. To put that into further context, if you put the violence compared to, there's about 20,000 incels active in the largest forum that they have, and they've killed about 59 people around the world. A similarly sized Islamist terrorist group, Boko Haram, they have about 15,000 members in Nigeria. They've killed approximately 350,000 people since 2002. And people accuse me of saying, oh, that's not quite the same thing. And that's the point, right? One is an organized terrorist group, and the other is a ragtag group of incels who don't even know who each other are. saying edgy stuff on the internet. So it's very, very important to kind of get a bit of perspective around the level of threat that they represent. But still, this ideology, there's an opportunity cost to a generation of young men giving up on dating, getting these misogynistic views, and also the mental health problems that are associated with incels. So massive overrepresentation of depression, anxiety, loneliness, autism, and suicidal ideation. So in our recent data, 20% of incels said they thought about self-harm or suicide every day over the last 2 weeks. A further 33% said they thought about suicide several days or more than half the days. So extraordinarily high levels of suicidal ideation. And for context, just 5% of people in the UK report having contemplated suicide once within the last year. So it's huge rates. Like I said, there's massive rates of autism. In our recent data, we used the AQ10 scale. And based on that measure, which is used to judge whether someone should be sent for a referral for a autism diagnosis, we found that 30% of incels in our sample would meet the criteria to get an autism referral. So it's likely, meanwhile, 18% of them self-report having a diagnosis. So really, when we think about incels in terms of extremism or the threat level from incels, it's likely that they are as much, if not more, of a threat to themselves than to anyone else. But the media seems to fixate on the potentiality for violence towards others rather than their mental health struggles.
So probably the most famous example of an incel killer is Elliot Rodger, of course. Elliot Rodger, as was often remarked after his murders, was not especially bad looking. And it's slightly perplexing to people who assume that incels must be physically repulsive, incredibly socially awkward, etc., that he would have identified as an incel. Do you have any insight into why it is? What personal qualities? We've mentioned autism already, which presumably makes engaging with the opposite sex more challenging. But what personal qualities do incels tend to have that lead them to identify as such?
It's interesting. I'm actually working on writing the ethical board application for a study I want to do, where I'm actually going to try and collect incel faces and have an attractiveness rating study
Okay,
to see
interesting.
one way or the other. Because it's an important question to answer, because there's all sorts of reports that incels are going for invasive cosmetic surgery procedures, going for extreme looks maxing measures.
Mm-hmm.
But by the same token, I see such a study as useful no matter what you find. If you find that incels are wrong about their physical unattractiveness, that might be actually one way to convince them, because there's no way to convince them that looks aren't the most important thing to women. They
Mm-hmm.
are fully convinced that looks are the most important thing to women, and that's why they're excluded. So if we could find data to show that incels would cross the threshold, that's the way I would conceptualize it, that they need to cross the threshold of physical attractiveness so that other traits are considered. If we could find data to suggest that is, maybe you could crack their black pill certainty. But on the other side, if you find that for some or for many that the physical attractiveness is the issue, that's important to know for a therapist working with them, to maybe help them cultivate healthier looks maxing habits, or to consider cosmetic surgery. There is meta-analyses to show that people who have cosmetic surgery to improve their attractiveness do enjoy a self-esteem boost and mental health boost. So women have been going under the knife to improve their physical attractiveness for decades, and we haven't been in a moral panic about that much. Maybe it's a plausible route for some men. So I'm interested to do that study. But in terms of their
Mm.
other characteristics, they are highly likely to be neat, so not in education, employment, or training. They have a strong tendency for interpersonal victimhood. They are highly sensitive to rejection. They perceive rejection at every turn. So if you look in their forums, they have specific forums for what they call rage fuel. And it's full of examples from their day-to-day life where they perceive themselves as being slighted by attractive women or normal people. They massively over-perceive the animosity society has for them. So they'll share examples like, oh, I walked into an elevator and the look of disgust on this woman's face when she seen me, it was palpable. They're really trying to engage in one-upmanship in this kind of perceived humiliation. But by the same token, a lot of them do report that they have been victims of bullying. Upwards of 60% say that they've experienced bullying in their childhood and adult life. And like I say, you have to take that with a little bit of a pinch of salt because they're so performatively victimhood oriented.
Mm-hmm.
But it is likely they have experienced some degree of bullying because they currently experience a lot of bullying. You can actually go online right now and say the meanest things you can imagine about incels as a group, and you will probably be applauded by the most progressive people you can imagine. There
Mm-hmm.
are whole forums dedicated to bullying incels. It's called Incel
Mm-hmm.
Tier Reddit forums. And the bullying in those forums got so bad that the Reddit forum, had to instantiate a rule to say you're no longer allowed to encourage suicide of incels in our discussion. So you can imagine
Mm-hmm.
things probably had to get pretty bad for them to instantiate that rule. So, and we have a broader literature on lookism, which shows that attractive people are kind of privileged in all sorts of different ways, and ugly people are discriminated against in ways that their physical attractiveness shouldn't really pertain to, like their
Mm-hmm.
jobs and things like that. So it is likely incels have some degree of hostility from society, but it's probably not as bad as they think. We actually published a paper showing that they underestimate the sympathy society has for them.
I mean, what is adolescence and the public response to it, if not the like national bullying of this group or the scapegoating of this group? I mean, it seems like the implication from the response is that incels are like witches or something. They have this incredibly oversized like spiritual power to induce evil in the nation. So it does actually rather vindicate their sense of victimization. No.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something I try and tell people when they ask, what should we do? How do we intervene about this problem? I think it's very important that we try to prove incels wrong about how society sees them. But the world is full of examples that incels can use to show the hostility we have for them. So, for
Yeah.
example, I'll be presenting these mental health findings in universities in the UK. And sometimes, depending on the audience, some people come back to me and say thing as close to saying, who cares, or why should we care? And there's also a reluctance to kind of blame the misogyny on mental health, or to even acknowledge that poor mental health might look like misogyny sometimes. But that's true. People in poor mental health lash out at society in all sorts of different ways. It doesn't look nice and warm and fuzzy. It looks ugly sometimes. It doesn't always look like a just middle class man getting in touch with his feminine side and talking to a therapist and opening up about what masculinity means to him. No matter how much people might want to think that's what poor mental health looks like, it just doesn't. It more often looks like
Mm,
Kanye West having a breakdown and getting anti Semitic. Like, people say you can't
mm,
blame that on mental health too. And like Dave Chappelle says, you can.
mm. The funny thing about incel culture, though, right, is like you mentioned that you used the word looks maxing earlier, which some listeners might not know what that means. You can kind of guess, right? It's like improving your appearance as much as you can. There's actually quite a lot of slang that's originated on incel forums, which has become really widespread, which is curious, isn't it? Because for such a very, very low status group, they have been very influential on pop culture. It's quite funny. Like lots of terms that are now common internet slang originate from incel culture.
Yeah, they really enjoy having this outsized influence on mainstream kind of dialogue. And yeah,
Yeah.
terms like being black pilled. You can be
Yep.
black pilled about lots of different things now. But
Yep.
yeah, that's one of the appeals to incels of their identity, rather than participating in a mating market that they don't see as productive.
Mm-hmm.
They prefer the fraternity of the misery with their fellow incels. They've got a
Mm.
rich trolling lexicon of fun kind of language. They have
Mm-hmm.
a victimhood identity. They have a common enemy. They have an excuse to no longer go through the anxiety and rejection of the mating market. When I
Mm-hmm.
started studying this, I thought, how could someone reach the conclusion? How could someone define themselves this way? Surely it's better to keep trying in the mating market. even if you have to go through hundreds of rejections, it's worth it on the other side. But the more I learned, I see that they're actually seduced by the identity itself. And they may be, it might be easy for you and I to say, oh, it's worth engaging with the mating market. What you end up with on the other end of it is good. It's worth it. But for incels, they may come to the conclusion that the juice just is not worth the squeeze, and they prefer the incel identity.
It's not that widely known that there is a female counterpart to this movement, which is femcells, right? And it's sort of interesting, isn't it, that actually femcells are not really known about. I've spent some time on femcell forums, and they're very interesting and also very depressing because the women there have a slightly different take, I guess, on their male counterparts, because the problem they are more likely to encounter is they might be able to get sex. Some femcells are so physically unattractive that they can't attract sex at all, but others can attract sex, casual sex, but they can't attract relationships. And so the thing that they're aggrieved about is not being able to attract love and affection rather than sex per se. But it's interesting that you're so right that incels attract this incredible amount of vitriol, and meanwhile femcells attract basically no attention. One explanation for that might be that it's because women just generally attract more sympathy than men do, which is, I think, true. But femcells don't attract any sympathy. Is it that I wonder if the reason incels are so kind of enraging is because they are perceived to be a sexual threat against women, that their bitterness is indicative of them being dangerous, and the fear that women will be at risk from them is what motivates the vitriol.
Yes, I think incels incite a lot of rage comparatively to femcells, because the real analog for femcells and incels is the woman who can't find a partner to commit to her. So incels would tell you there's no such thing as a femcell because most women can get sex. It just might not be the sex or relationship that she wants. And the term they have for this is called being alpha widowed, where they describe women who, as you describe, they're able to attract perhaps a higher mate value man for sex, but can't get him to commit to her. And in incel's mind, this creates the illusion in the woman that that's her level, and she no longer wants to settle for her looks match or her mate value match. And that might be happening to some women, that men are known to lower their standards for short-term mating. So there may be some degree of alpha widowing happening. Now, I don't think it renders women incapable of forming a relationship thereafter once they've been alpha widowed by Chad. I don't think that that's a massive epidemic, but it is a fundamental feature of sex differences in sexual psychology that men and women should understand. I think there's no need for a femcell subculture because it's hidden in plain sight. You have New York Times articles every week about how men are not measuring up to women's standards. And what's more likely is women who are not finding men who meet their standards, they're choosing singlehood and they're encountering unwanted childlessness. A lot of the reasons women cite for unwanted childlessness is not having found the right partner in time, not being able to get someone who meets my standards, who will commit to me in time. It's also one of the major reasons for women engaging in the egg freezing. The main reason they cite is we haven't found partners who meet our standards in time. So the analog is kind of, there's no need for the bitter subculture of femcells. That does exist to a small degree, but hidden in plain sight is this disgruntlement at the mating market and the low caliber of men on offer.
That's true, yeah. I mean, that when I think of femcells, I think more of the women I've encountered on Reddit who are very, very, very physically unattractive, like to the point where they even struggle with friendships, that people are, women who are basically disfigured or have a serious physical problem. They tend not to be the ones complaining in the New York Times about not landing a good man. But
Yes.
I agree in general, though, that there's an outlet for women to complain about the mating market that is not just socially acceptable, but actually highly praised, whereas there isn't that for men.
Yeah, incels have a massive failure of cross-sex mind reading about what they see as women enjoying the privilege of being able to have all this sexual attention, because
Yeah.
they use their male mind to think, wouldn't that be great, all this sexual attention? But if it's not the sexual attention you want, it might as well not exist. And incels just see some is always better than none. But for women,
Yeah.
some is not always better than none, especially about sex, which is so costly.
Yeah.
A lot of women would rather have no sex than sex they don't want.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd say that that's the female norm. And in fact, that having unwanted sexual advances all the time can be frightening.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that incels understand that. But then equally, I don't think that most women understand the deep sense of shame and frustration that incels feel.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, I think the assumption is just whatever, be single, get on with it. You mentioned earlier the incel preoccupation with looks and the idea that you just, if you're not sufficiently good looking as a man, that's it. You can never find a mate, which is slightly surprising or slightly incongruous with other aspects of Manosphere thinking based on evolutionary biology, which is that women are interested in status more than they're interested in looks, and that actually a man who's not very good looking can massively compensate for that by being wealthy or funny or powerful or whatever. Do they just not accept that premise? They think that actually looks are more important than most evolutionary psychology would suggest?
Yeah, absolutely. They reject evolutionary psychology findings that status matters more for women. They
Mm-hmm.
think what matters is looks, money, status. And
Mm.
above all, looks. They're really fixated on this. And it
Mm-hmm.
might be the case that they're most resentful about the looks component because it is only extremely handsome men that can attract a lot of short-term mating opportunities from women. Most men
Mm-hmm.
have to provide value in some other way and come to a compromise and form long-term relationships. So incels are actually much more unrestricted in their sociosexual desire. So it makes sense that what they resent most or are envious of is those few men who can pursue that strategy. But I've noticed an interesting move from incels lately. So they originally or typically say, oh, the black pill means unattractive men cannot form relationships. It's just impossible for them. 80-20 rule, all of this. But that's easily falsified by just looking around you, right? Like it's demonstrably false. You can see ugly men with wives and kids all around you. It happens all the time. Most men pull it off, they find a way. But incels have now moved to acknowledging that, but saying, well, those men can't cultivate genuine desire. And that's a very different claim because that's pretty like unfalsifiable. It's not clear to me what incels would accept as proof of an average looking man cultivating genuine sexual desire. How would he prove his wife has an orgasm every night? Would the incels accept that? Probably not. They'd probably say she fakes it. So it's a very Martin Bailey style tactic whereby, and I think what's going on is they just don't accept anything as worth having unless it's what they perceive Chad has. So the very handsome man who can access short-term mating just by virtue of his physical attractiveness. And it's very, very rare. Even the most attractive men, they're not inundated with opportunities for short-term sex. It's their incels are mistaken on that.
So they're deeply, deeply envious of the men who are most high status in their eyes.
Yeah. Or who are most attractive.
What kind of age are incels? Is that something you asked in your survey questions?
Yes, we did. So the average in most of our studies comes out at around 26.
Okay.
Interestingly enough, for gay men, gay male incels tend to be a lot older, which kind of mirrors the mating preferences of gay men.
There are gay incels.
But specifically only older ones when their youth and
Okay.
physical beauty runs out. So
Oh, I see.
gay male sexuality is often described in evolutionary psychology as undiluted male sexual psychology. You don't have to make the
Mm-hmm.
compromises you have to make with women. So
Mm-hmm.
they have sex fast upon initiation, they have as much variety of sex as they want. There's not really lesbian bars for hookups in the same way there are for gay men, or Grindr functions in a very different way for
Mm-hmm.
lesbian women than for gay men. So it's interesting that the sexual behavior seems to map onto the sex rather than the sexual orientation discreetly.
Yeah, it is very interesting. So gay incels are men who are now too old for the scene and feel frustrated.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. So, okay, so that's kind of older than I thought, because I did wonder to what extent this is really quite young men who actually just haven't experienced very much of the world yet. And so they are making false assumptions based on incomplete experience and information. But actually, 26 is relatively old.
Yeah, but I do think that that's right, that
Hmm.
they are forming their impression of how the mating market works and getting this impression that everyone is having a lot more sex than they really are because of the online world. If you walk through a city, it's kind of sex saturated in the advertisements and everywhere. It's in every gossip column. It's in a plot line in every TV show. It's very central to the culture in our entertainment. So you get this
Hmm.
impression that everyone is having it, when in actual fact they're not having as much as people think. Incels also talk about this kind of irretrievable magic of young romance. So they always describe that they will never be able to cultivate the magic of like youthful adolescent romance, which is very interesting. And when I talk to incels, I talk to them about how would you know if you're no longer an incel? What would have to change? Would you have to get one girlfriend, have sex one time? What would have to change? And they all say the same thing. They talk about it like alcoholism, that they could relapse. You could relapse back into this thinking. And that's kind of what I mean with this genuine desire thing. It's an open question what happens to incels when they ascend. The incels who form relationships, are they riddled with this doubt about whether or not their partner really desires them? I think that's a big fear. And I actually ran a quick Twitter poll about this, about men and women, whether you have this, how often you have this feeling that your partner could have done better or settled for you. And it was really high among men in particular, and among women. And that kind of made me a bit sad, because you could all rack yourself with worry thinking about this, but what's the point in doing that, right? Like, you're never going to know, and you just move on.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.